Okay everyone, this here's your friendly history teacher and I'm back with another episode of Everything You Need to Know. And in this episode we will be discussing black codes, Jim Crow, and the Ku Klux Klan. The first thing you need to know is what exactly was black codes. Now, black codes were these laws that were passed in the 1860s in the early days of Reconstruction, when white Southerners still had some control over local politics. This would have been Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction era. And these laws were basically Southern laws that were aimed at limiting the rights of the newly freed slaves. You can kind of compare these to the slave codes of the pre-Civil War era. The basic design of these was just, hey, we're going to return the African Americans, the freedmen, to as close to slave-like conditions as we possibly can. Now, Congress, when they hear reports of how bad things are in these southern states, they're going to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. Now, the Civil Rights Act is going to be vetoed by Andrew Johnson. In the last video, we talked about how he was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, former slave owner, just happened to side with the Union and get, chosen by Lincoln to be his VP candidate in the election of 1864 to kind of give Lincoln that extra cushion he needed to win, grab some Democrat votes. Johnson wanted Reconstruction to be over quickly, just as smooth and easy as could possibly be. And he's going to veto the Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau bill, to aid the newly freed slaves. And it's going to be overturned by Congress. They're going to be like, no, buddy, we're taking over Reconstruction. Now, Jim Crow laws are what are effectively going to come in toward the end of Reconstruction and really start taking hold in the late 1870s, 1880s. These kind of replace the black code. So it kind of goes slave codes, which were in effect, in the southern states when they were when slavery still existed, to the black codes to try and limit, where African Americans could go. That's kind of what those laws were, trying to keep them in slave-like conditions. And when Reconstruction ends, we're going to get these things called Jim Crow laws. Now the name comes from an old popular song, that ends with the phrase, "Jump Jim Crow." And there's usually an African American character, in the script music that went with this song. So they just kind of apply it to these laws. Now what these are racial segregation laws. These are laws that are aimed at creating two completely different societies in these southern states, a black society and a white society. So you're going to have separate drinking fountains, you're going to have separate waiting rooms. When it comes to transportation, there will be a black railroad car, a white railroad car. Schools will be segregated. This school's for black students, this one's for white students. Even parks. I mean, a lot of these states even had laws, in barber shops and things like that. Doctors, it was illegal for an African American doctor in some states to treat a white patient. Now these laws are going to be challenged in a Supreme Court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. This comes along in 1896. This was the first real legitimate challenge to these laws that make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And here in 1896, the Supreme Court has a chance to strike these laws down. But sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. In this case, this was a planned, what they did is they sent a person who I believe was 1/8 or 1/16. He had very little African American blood, but they kind of set it up where he would go on this railroad car and they had someone there who would challenge him and he would refuse to obey. He would be arrested, and that way they could challenge the law in Louisiana for separate railroad cars. Well, they got what they wanted. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. But in this case, the Supreme Court actually said, well, these laws are actually legal. They said it's perfectly fine to have a black railroad car and a white railroad car for passengers, so long as the facilities are separate but equal. So in other words, if you're serving both sides and you're providing them accommodations, this is perfectly okay. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about at all. So this set up this thing called separate but equal. This gives these southern states, and it's not just happening in the South, but this is where most of the African American population was. But you see these laws in other parts of the country as well. Separate but equal. So long as we're providing equal accommodations to both sides, it's just fine. So this legitimized all of the Jim Crow laws, and it kind of entrenched them for nearly the next 60 years. It's not going to be till the 1950s in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that they are going to overturn these laws. That's how long it's going to take. Now, you always wonder if the Supreme Court had overturned these laws in 1896, what would the country be like today? We just never really know. Now, the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan kind of comes out of the post-Civil War environment. A lot of white Southerners were very frustrated by obviously the losing the war. 1 in 3 white Southern men are killed or seriously maimed. The loss of political power once the radical Republicans, the ones who take control and seize it from Andrew Johnson, when they essentially make him a lame duck president and then, vote to impeach him, and he's nearly removed by 1 vote. This guy is completely just sitting there doing nothing. Congress starts running the country by themselves, and they start implementing what Southerners would, by our standard today, call a draconian system of Reconstruction, where they put it under military control, and they start using the newly freed African males as a voting bloc for the Republicans to have power. Lots of white Southerners could not vote. There are all kinds of laws passed stripping them of their political power. So the radical Republicans are the ones running the Southern politics. So a lot of white Southerners were very angry. Some of them started forming vigilante groups to try and, in their opinion, restore order. So some of them are going to use various, but the ones that get all the attention, there are other groups like the Knights of the White Chameleon, but the Ku Klux Klan, they're the one that gets all the press. And the Ku Klux Klan and other groups are going to try to restore order, which would mean giving white Southern men control of Southern politics again. Now, the Ku Klux Klan is founded on Christmas Eve, 1865, in the town of Pulaski, Tennessee. And it kind of starts out as a social club of only like 6 people. But eventually it is going to grow into an entire, what you would call the invisible empire or invisible organization across the South that is going to try and end radical Republican rule. So the Klan tactics that they're going to use, their number one goal is to restore white Southern order. And if the African Americans are the major voting bloc of the Republican Party in the South, they're going to use violence and intimidation to try and keep, black Southerners from voting. They want to end what is called carpetbag rule. Now, carpetbaggers were white Northerners who kind of threw, the name comes from, they were running into the post-war South, all the destruction and all the political, vacuum that's taken place to try and get rich and powerful. So they throw some possessions in a carpet bag, and they're going to run down there to the South and try and seize power. So that's where the name comes from. So you got carpetbaggers. These were Northerners who ran into the South to try and establish some kind of rule down there. And you've got the scallywags. These would be your white Southerners who sided with the radical Republicans. And of course the African American voting bloc would be huge in this as well. So the Klan, they're going to use violence, intimidation. It was always worse around, voting time than any other. They'd burn the crosses in the yard, use threats. Here we see in this picture, bust the door open, fire a few shots inside the house to scare them. And of course the Klan always claimed to be the ghost of, dead Confederate soldiers coming to restore order. So they're wanting to weaken Republican control of Southern politics by any means necessary. It's estimated that they might have killed up to 20,000 people. We don't really know. It's not like the Klan kept records. And it's not like everyone who donned a white hood and went out and murdered someone was actually in the Klan. I mean, it kind of became chaos down there. If you had a vendetta or something, you could throw on the hood and go out and murder someone, and of course the Klan would get the blame. Now we know the Klan did kill lots and lots of people. There were some counties in Florida where the number of people they lynched was just absolutely terrifying. So the radical Republicans in Congress are going to try and do something to weaken the Ku Klux Klan. So they passed these things called the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871 to try and weaken the Klan. These laws allowed for federal elections to be supervised either by Union, U.S. troops or other various means. And they could use these federal troops to actually fight the Klan if they had to. So these had some mixed results. But the problem is, as the 1870s wore on, they're just getting sick of Reconstruction, both Northerners and Southerners. And in 1872, Congress is going to pass the Amnesty Act. Now, as far as bringing the country closer together and ending Reconstruction, this would be a step forward. But for the African Americans, this would not be a good thing because the Amnesty Act is going to give about 150,000 former Confederates the right to vote. You couple this with the Klan and other actions trying to keep blacks from voting, you can see white Southerners are slowly going to start regaining control. They also allowed the Freedmen's Bureau to expire. Now this was a federal agency that was ran through the United States Army to try and educate and protect the newly freed slaves, help them get jobs, and assure that they were getting treated fairly when it came to jobs and pay. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau did a lot of good down there. It was mainly white Northerners who came down to set up and run these schools because you had millions of newly freed slaves who could not read, could not write, and there was really no means of protecting them or providing them with jobs or getting these slaves to be treated fairly by the white Southerners was a huge problem. So the Freedmen's Bureau was there to do this, and the Freedmen's Bureau is going to expire, and that's going to create serious problems. But eventually the white Southerners regain control of politics. So that is the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow laws, black codes, all of that stuff explained. If you found this video useful, then please subscribe down below. We're doing an entire series on this stuff. So till next time, this is Robert with Reading Through History, and this is everything you need to know.